What's up, everybody? For today's edition of the Horsepower Monster, I am leaving my usual stomping grounds in stock car country and flying to Terre Haute, Indiana. Terre Haute, to meet up with Lance Stillwell, owner of Motorsports Unlimited. Lance is getting down and dirty with some mud boggers, and we're going to be building a 1,000 plus horsepower big block Chevy. Hang on. Tyler Knight runs this tube frame Chevy S10 throughout Illinois and the Midwest. Currently, he's running a 460 with a stock bottom end that he estimates makes around 600 horsepower. And he's getting tired of running up against guys pushing over 1,000 horsepower. Unfortunately, like most of us, Tyler lives in the real world and he doesn't have unlimited bucks to spend on his rig. So Stillwell did his homework and came up with a combo that maximizes performance while also keeping the overall spend realistic. The goal? We're going to make over 1,000 horsepower naturally aspirated for less than 20 grand.
Basically, we're building this for a Mud Bog / Mud Drag series. Pretty serious deal to where there's a lot of 600 plus cubic inch engines in this class as well. So basically, we're trying to build something here on, within a customer's budget to get him competitive. We come up with a 582 combination that I think we can get there and get him pretty competitive and stay within his budget. One of the things we try not to do is totally kill torque with it. So we're going to try to make X amount of horsepower and maintain a certain amount of torque to work within his range. So that was our main goal, was to get good enough parts that it's going to last more than 1 year within a budget and make the power to be competitive.
To reach our goal of achieving race-winning power without wiping out the bank account, Stillwell is going with all off-the-shelf parts. In fact, Stillwell and Motorsports Unlimited have a strong relationship with engine parts distributor PBM Performance Products. So 99% of this build comes straight out of their catalog. That was key to staying under the 20 grand budget. Stillwell avoided a lot of headaches by skipping right past trying to modify a stock block so that it'll perform and survive the punishment that Tyler will be dishing out in the Mud Bog pit. Instead, he ordered up one of World Products' Merlin 4 big blocks. The rulebook for the class Tyler races in is actually pretty thin. The major points are he has to run street legal tires, which means none of those cool paddle tires. The engine has to be naturally aspirated and the block has to be iron. That makes the Merlin 4 a perfect choice. For the Merlin 4, World Products really did their homework. This includes beefier main webs for increased strength, thicker cylinder walls, and nice thick decks. On top of that, there's also a revised oiling system. The Merlin 4 still gives priority oiling to the mains, but now there's even more volume available from larger galleries. The 4-bolt nodular iron main caps also come standard, and clearance notches to help handle more stroke are cast right into the block. With the block prepped and ready to go, Stillwell drops in the forged PBM crank just to quickly check crankshaft thrust. It checked out with 0.08 of an inch of thrust, which is well within spec, so the crank is set aside and we'll get back to it in just a moment. A huge key when it comes to making naturally aspirated power is camshaft choice. We're using a solid roller ground by Urson cams. But before any cam will go into an engine at Motorsports Unlimited, Stillwell will first check every lobe on his Performance Trends cam analyzer. Stillwell has worked extensively with the tech department at Urson to get the best grind for this build, and we can respect his desire that any advantage he finds over the competition he keeps to himself. But we can tell you this big roller sports a duration similar to the weight of an NFL offensive lineman, and the exhaust is approximately 25 degrees larger than the intakes. And with the 1.7 to 1 rocker arms that'll be going on, valve lift is north of 800 thousandths of an inch. Actually, way north of 800, especially the intakes. Finally, we also know that it is a 4-7 swap, but I've been threatened with physical harm if I say anything about splits or center lines. So lips are zipped. Obviously, not many of us have the resources to keep a cam analyzer in the shop, but Stillwell points out that Urson is one of the few cam companies that doesn't just send out a standard cam card with every cam. They actually run every cam through either a cam analyzer or a cam doctor and send along the spec sheet with the digital measurements for every load. Pretty neat. With the cam in place, the Clevite H-Series main bearings are given a coat of Redline assembly lube. Then the PBM crank with the 4.375-inch stroke is settled into the main saddles. The World Products block can definitely handle more stroke than this, but remember, we're going for fairly high RPMs here to help generate horsepower. This crank has a standard big block size 2 3/4-inch main journal and 2.200-inch rod journals. Previously, we already mentioned the bore size is 4-inch 600 thousandths, so with the 4.375 stroke, total displacement will be 582 cubic inches. The main caps are nodular iron and more than strong enough to handle the power levels we're targeting. All 4 caps are secured with rod bolts, and the inner 3 have splayed outers. With light oil lubricating the threads, each of the bolts are torqued to 100 foot-pounds. Main clearance should be around 3/1000ths of an inch. A billet steel double roller timing set ties the crankshaft to the cam. Notice the multiple keyways on the lower pulley to help advance or retard the cam timing to get the ideal setting. Now let's move on to the rotating assembly. Like the crank, the connecting rods are also from PBM. Hey, I told you Stillwell stayed in the PBM catalog. These H-beam rods are 6 inches 535 thousandths long with a bushed little end for a floating pin. We were really impressed with the quality of the PBM rods. Stillwell measured the big end bore size with Clevite H bearings in place and marked them on the beam of each rod. As you can see, the consistency is excellent. Going on to the connecting rods will be a set of aluminum slugs from JE Pistons with a low friction coating on the skirts. A lot of development work has gone into developing the dome with a piston top that brings compression ratio up while also not hurting the flame travel speed. Notice the pockets to fit the big block's canted valves. Overall, we're looking at a compression ratio somewhere around 15:1. The holes around the perimeter of the piston tops are vertical gas ports. They lead from the top of the piston to the top ringland just behind the ring. During the combustion stroke, pressure from the expanding gases caused by burning fuel will actually travel through each port and push the top ring out against the cylinder bore. The result is a greatly improved seal between the ring and the cylinder bore, even with lightweight, low friction rings. Stillwell uses plenty of assembly lube as he assembles the pistons on the rods, and spiral locks keep the wrist pins in place. Lance's dad, Dan, handles the ring gapping duties. These rings measure up at 0.43, 0.43, and 3 millimeters, and the gaps are cut at 22 thousandths for the top rings and 24 for the second. It's important to note that these long 6-inch 535 thousandths connecting rods does cause the wrist pin to extend into the ringland for the oil ring, so a support rail must be used before the oil ring assembly can go into place. Now that the piston and rod assemblies are completed, it's time to finish up the short block. Stillwell brushes more assembly lube on the crank's rod journals and starts dropping the pistons and rods into place. The PBM connecting rods are a little unique in that they use a 1-inch 600 thousandths long rod bolt versus the usual 1-inch 800. It's still a high quality ARP 2000 bolt, but the shorter length does mean that when you check rod stretch, you want no more than 0.0062 of an inch of stretch. Stillwell double checks this with his stretch gauge, but PBM recommends 70 foot-pounds with ARP Ultra Torque lube on the threads. Once all the rods are bolted up, Stillwell uses feeler gauges to check rod side clearance and then moves on to degreeing in the camshaft. We wound up with 20 thousandths clearance between the sides of the connecting rods and the cheeks of the crank, which is plenty. While degreeing in the cam, he also takes a moment to check camshaft in play, which is critical on roller cams. It turned out it was just a bit tighter than the 0.010 of an inch or so that Stillwell is comfortable with, so he machines just a few thousandths of an inch off the inside face of the cast timing cover just to create a little more clearance. One of the few lines in the very thin mud bogging rulebook says that the engine has to be a wet sump, so Stillwell looks to gain durability and maybe just a bit of an advantage with a highly efficient billet oil pump from Moroso. Believe it or not, this beefy 6061 billet aluminum pump actually weighs less than a stock pump and pickup. But the big advantage is the lack of cavitation and improved flow created by this next-gen pump with its built-in pickup. Oh, by the way, that built-in pickup does mean that an oil pan with an 8-inch deep sump is required. And that's exactly what we've got in this fabricated pan from Canton. This drag race pan is built with oil control in mind and features gates and baffles to keep the oil in the sump trapped against the pickup. There's also a windage tray to minimize windage even when the oil is at the full 7-quart capacity, and that's not counting the oil filter. Stillwell always measures the crank snout with an outside mic before installing the damper. In this case, that's an SFI certified unit from ATI. You do need some press to keep the damper snug to the crank snout, but no more than 1.5 thousandths of an inch. More than that and you're just scraping off metal. If the fit is too tight, he can hone the ID of the damper to open it up just a bit. As we turn our attention to the valve train, Stillwell double checks all the lifter bores with an inside micrometer just to make sure the clearances are correct one more time before the lifters are installed. Speaking of the lifters, these are a sweet set of solid rollers from Morrell. Note the tall lifter bodies to clear the lifter bores even when a small base circle cam is used. A multi-layer steel head gasket is necessary to help hold the combustion pressures when we are talking about 1,000 plus horsepower and 15:1 compression. The cylinder heads are by Profiler Performance Products. These are Profiler's Sniper X 24-degree heads. They come CNC ported, but Motorsports Unlimited has done some additional handwork with their own custom touches. Right out of the box, these heads are rated at 460 CFM through the 375 cc intake runner and over 325 CFM through the exhaust. Since the chambers have been handworked, they are just a bit larger than the 119 cc's they come from the factory. The valves are sourced from Urson and are stainless steel. They are also larger than stock at 2 inches 350 thousandths for the intakes and 1 inch 850 thousandths for the exhaust, both with an 11/32 stem. Stillwell drops them in place over a set of ARP head studs. Studs are popular in racing applications because they provide better clamping load than head bolts, and then they're torqued to 80 foot-pounds. The valve springs are a triple nested setup Stillwell chose from Urson's Professional Series lineup. They have a 1 inch 677 thousandths OD and a 2 inch 100 thousandths installed height, with Urson's titanium retainers holding them in place to reduce overall valve train mass. The seat pressure is 350 pounds, and while Stillwell is keeping maximum valve lift to himself, he did share that the open spring pressure is somewhere around 1,000 pounds. With the red line approaching 8,000 RPM, maintaining valve train stability will be a key. A set of T&D shaft mount rockers will help with that considerably. It all begins with bolting the steel rocker stands to the cylinder heads. The rocker stands use the threaded bolt holes in the cylinder heads for the rocker studs. It's important to note that some of those holes cut into the intake ports, so a thread sealer will be needed on the threads for those bolts. There is a single rocker stand for the intake rockers, while each exhaust rocker has its own stand because the big blocks canted valve angles. For maximum rigidity, the exhaust rocker stands bolt both to the cylinder head and to the larger intake rocker stand. The next step is to install the push rods because they cannot go in place if the rocker arms are already bolted up. But Stillwell likes to thoroughly cover each lifter in oil, so first he pours 7 quarts of Driven Racing Oil's mineral-based break-in oil into the valley, fully covering the lifters. One advantage of sticking with a short deck block is you can use correspondingly shorter push rods. which helps reduce high RPM pushrod flex. We're using Urson Professional Series units that are 8 3/4 inches long for the intakes and 9.350 for the exhaust. All are still a beefy 7/16 of an inch in diameter with 165 thousandths wall thickness. The rocker arms go on next. These T&D rockers have the big block standard 1.7:1 ratio and are machined from aluminum to help minimize valve train mass. With a shaft mount system like this, the height of the rocker arms is controlled by either placing shims underneath the stands to raise the rocker arms or machining some of the top of the cylinder head to lower them. Thankfully, all we had to do was add a couple of shims to get everything right. While installing the rocker arms, Stillwell also sets the lash. Cold lash will be 20 thousandths of an inch for both the intakes and exhausts, and we're targeting 26 thousandths for the intakes and 28 for the exhausts once the engine gets hot. Even the best cylinder heads can't do their job if they aren't properly fed air and fuel by the intake manifold. Stillwell decided to keep it all in the family when he chose an intake by sticking with Profiler. This is the company's Sniper single plane intake designed to work well with their cylinder heads on big inch big blocks. It's supposed to be ideal all the way up to 8,000 RPM, and part of the way it achieves this is by being pretty tall even for a single plane intake at 7.4 inches. Routing the spark is an MSD Pro Billet distributor. Stillwell locks out the mechanical advance to simplify the system, and it will be connected to an MSD 6AL ignition box for power. We mentioned earlier that this will be going into a mud bogging truck with a fabricated tube frame chassis. Like many racing chassis, the engine mounts up with a motor plate, which helps provide for greater rigidity than standard motor mounts. After the plate is bolted up, Dan Stillwell installs the electric water pump as well as the belt-driven vacuum pump. A vacuum pump helps create power by pulling vacuum inside the crankcase. The reduction in atmosphere helps reduce operating friction, but it also helps improve ring seal and reduces blow-by. This 3-vane Moroso pump is cut from billet aluminum and can move a ton of air. It plumbs into a fitting in one of the valve covers and exhausts air through an aluminum puke tank, which is mounted to the end of the motor plate. Here you can see our big block all set up on the engine dyno. The last touch is a Dominator-sized Holley carburetor. This is actually one of Holley's Ultra Dominators and is rated at 1350 CFM. And by the way, we'll be burning Renegade 112 Plus race fuel. Once all that air and fuel is burned, the exhaust gases will pass through a set of 2 1/4 inch dyno headers. So finally, it's time to fire our big block up and let her rip. After a break-in and a quick check of the valves, we were ready to start making some pulls. This was after making a few pulls to dial in the jets on the big Dominator carb and running a few timing tests. We started with the timing at 33 degrees advanced, but at this point we were up to 38 degrees of timing and 98 jets in all 4 corners of the carb. The results were pretty impressive. Our peaks are 833.9 foot-pounds of torque at 5,800 RPM and 1,040 horsepower at 7,000 RPM. We wanted to show you that run because the next pull was a test to see if a carb spacer could help power. We added a 1-inch open hole spacer, but honestly didn't think it would do that much because the Profiler Sniper intake is already so tall. Surprisingly, we saw an improvement of just over 5 horsepower with the spacer, although it did cost us about 1.5 foot-pounds of peak torque. Across the run, the average power and torque picked up by a little over 2, so it definitely was a good addition. It just goes to show you never really know until you try. After that, we continued testing, slowly inching up the timing advance until we found the engine was happiest at 40.5 degrees advance. Jetting, meanwhile, remained at 98ths on all 4 corners. Stillwell was super happy with the results, as this big block produced 834 foot-pounds of torque at 5,700 RPM and 1,053 horsepower at 7,300. Plus, it isn't a peaky RPM band at all. And that level of performance is especially impressive considering the engine is built completely with off-the-shelf parts. We didn't even use custom pistons and charged less than $20,000 for the complete engine, including carburetor, distributor, and all the accessories necessary to get running. But before we called it a day, we decided to do one last test. Sensors on the dyno told us that the Moroso vacuum pump was pulling about 4.5 psi inside the crankcase. We were curious to see if that was actually improving net horsepower versus the energy required to pull that vacuum. So, we pulled the suction hose off the valve cover. The pump still spins, but since it's open to the atmosphere and not actually pulling vacuum, the horsepower drain shouldn't be that much. Anyhow, let's see what it does. Unhooking the vacuum pump cost us 12.1 foot-pounds of torque and an incredible 52.6 horsepower. Now granted, some of that horsepower loss does come from the fact that we are still spinning the pump, but since it's free spinning, the power drain shouldn't be all that much. In the right application, a vacuum pump is a definite bonus. Anyhow, what we do know is that Mud Bogger Tyler Knight absolutely couldn't wait to get this big block off our hands and put it into his truck. With nearly double the horsepower of his old mill, we see a lot of podium finishes in his future. Hey, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time with more great engine builds.